So you're all very welcome. My name is Jeffrey Rowe. I'm the current chairperson of the Computing and Electronic Division. We're very excited to have this talk here tonight, Beyond the Security Patch. If you're interested in Engineers Ireland's and computing and electronics in general, we do lots of webinars around it. So I'm going to invite Ben up onto the stage to get us started on tonight's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good evening. Thank you for attending the talk, and thank you for attending this Beyond the Patch. I hope that this will be interesting and valuable to yourselves, and we hope that we challenge you in your current approach to cybersecurity within your own respective environments and businesses. So we make the assumption that the OEMs will consistently release patches and updates to address security in your environments. What I'll say is I think that's a bit flawed. Even when patches are developed, it can be days before they're deployed. All that time, you're exposed to that risk within your environment. Additionally, they're often developed for the mass market. And so individualization or tailorization for you, it can be quite financially impractical. The patch fix approach often assumes that software is in its original state with no modifications. And many OEMs will only support the core code of those products. And what we see is quite a lot of them come with open source elements, to which they will direct you to the associated parties. So what we are here to challenge you today is that there is a more tailored and targeted approach required, if you will, going beyond the patch.
But as we all know, risk is impact times likelihood. And when we're talking about the impact, we're talking about the consequences of compromise and the likelihood of successful exploitation. And just to remind everyone, risk can never be zero.
So my name is Ben Lipczynski. I'm a head of Origna security global practice. My background evolves from a maritime and electrical engineering, and throughout my career, I've been responsible and accountable for the safety and security of many large systems. This has evolved from either the UK's Trident nuclear deterrent or global telecommunications networks. More latterly, I've consulted in cybersecurity for financial services and critical infrastructures, and today I lead in terms of service development and innovation within the cybersecurity space.
My name is Lee Lewis. I'm currently the Security Operations Manager within Origna. And as Ben has mentioned, Origna is a third-party support and maintenance provider for IBM and divested HCL products. My career evolved from a background in IT and radio systems engineering. I have over 15 years experience in leading technical teams from major organizations across multiple industry sectors. This has often been in securing their critical assets. And this has been through being as part of a global security operations team through to security risk consultation and assessment.
Now, what we're saying, or what we're not saying, is ignore your patches. But what we are saying is don't rely upon them. They're not that silver bullet that a lot of people believe they are. There is an assumption that OEMs will always release a patch or fix to address security issues, and that those patches or fixes will actually work and keep you safe. But from the analysis that we conduct, that's not always the case. Consider, if you will, when a product's gone end of life. The OEM will quite typically have moved those engineers onto other products. So if a new vulnerability is identified in that older product, are they going to develop a patch fix? And even if they do, it might be months before you receive it. All that time you are exposed to that vulnerability or that risk of exploit of that vulnerability. And another thing that we must consider about patch fixes is they're deployed for the masses. It makes business sense for the large OEMs. It's how they make their money and reinvest in their product development. But it makes little financial sense for them to, on a mass scale, tailor it to your own individual technologies in environments, custom code, custom configuration, if you will. What we're saying is we believe you need a more tailored and targeted approach. And it's not that hard or larger an investment. Now, I'm not here to start a debate on the difference between Pepsi and Coca-Cola. That can rage on outside of these walls. However, this is a great scenario where you have two competing firms, each making a fizzy carbonated drink, and highly likely employing the same technologies in their enterprise and production environment systems, but to be differentiated in their market space, whether that be marketing, but also in technology, production, and enterprise systems. They're probably using the same products, but very different ways. They probably have all implemented their own code and their own configuration so that they can gain shares or market gains within their own respective, within the respective market. And how many times have you applied a patch fix to your environment and it stopped working? Probably because you use custom code and the OEM's unaware of it. I mean, why else do we spend our Friday evenings after developing patch fixes like this? So what's beyond the patch? How can we better secure our environment from malicious actors, but now, but also in the future? Let's explore beyond the event horizon.
So let's take a look at what you can do through the application of a contextual risk-based defense in depth approach. Firstly, you can't defend what you don't know. And as we all know, a patch is only one part of an effective vulnerability management program. And it is important that organizations make an assessment and evaluate their overall cybersecurity posture in a broader context using a layered approach that includes the following steps. So from a contextual perspective, organizations must assess their business, people, processes, technologies, regulatory, and threat landscape. This allows them to identify any potential risks utilizing cyber threat intelligence to ensure that the appropriate mitigating actions are developed. And as we know, within your organizations, your unique set of circumstances are imperative to ensure that when you have those identified risks, that you develop the appropriate mitigating actions. One approach organizations can take to gain an understanding of the risks that they could face is through the utilization of cyber threat intelligence. Cyber threat intelligence is a combination of machine-driven learning and threat analysts who review multiple sources of information and intelligence to understand any likely risks that they could face. However, this is only possible when you truly know and understand the context of your environment and know exactly what you're looking for. Having access to a 24/7, 365 tailored actionable intelligence allows you to identify those potential risks early and then develop the appropriate mitigation actions. One key thing to remember is, whilst intelligence can help you identify those risks, it is important to assess them and validate whether those risks actually apply to your true environmental context.
So the next thing we recommend is consider implementing a risk-based approach. What is that? Well, what we are proposing is that you need to reduce the likelihood of an identified security vulnerability. But also through adapting a risk-based approach, you can maximize your limited resources, whether that be your defensive technologies, your third parties, or your own security and engineering teams. With the risk-based approach, though, because everything's changing, you then have to iterate on it on a periodic basis, again, at a periodicity, which is akin or aligned with your risk-based acceptable model. So a risk-based approach is a method of decision-making or problem-solving that prioritizes actions based on the risk that they present. It involves identifying and analyzing all that data and assessing the likelihood of potential consequences from occurring, and then making or taking action to reduce that likelihood. The approach aims, as I said, to allocate resources in a more effective and efficient manner, focusing your efforts on addressing those most significant risks first, therefore maximizing that investment. And when is enough? Considering a risk can never be zero, as highlighted by Lee, I would challenge you as to whether you've established an effective risk management program, one that can be maintained and one through which you can identify what is an acceptable level of risk. Now, often we can't touch the impact. That is how your product is used in your environment. That is what happens if that product was to be compromised. And it's clearly there to deliver some business function. But what we can affect or impact is the likelihood of that environment being compromised, whether that be data exfiltration or its prevention from working, as an example. So how can the reduction of likelihood of compromise be achieved? Well, first, we have to look at the if only it was that easy. First of all, we have to look at the likelihood. We have to look at the reality of the situation. Now, what we identified last year was over 80% of successful cyber attacks, so where the threat actor achieved their objective in 2023, was due to exploitation of misconfiguration. Easily avoidable situations. Now, this can be achieved in a few ways, or the prevention can be achieved through ways. Effective hardening routines of your environment. So validation that your deployment and configuration is in the most secure fashion. Again, informed and driven by either threat intelligence or your own intelligence, penetration testing, for example. And then reiterating. So if a change has been made, reiterate. If a new technology has been deployed, reiterate. Additionally, in Origna, we have also identified and we witnessed that a great deal of those vulnerabilities are not residing within the core code of these products, but within the open source elements. And what you'll find, if you read the small print, many OEMs will not actually look at the vulnerabilities or protect you in those open source components. Now, these are there for good reason. Quite typically, the open source components, your Javas, if you will, are there to aid in your interoperability within your environment. So they do have a solid purpose. But I would always challenge you and review your contracts and ask the question, if a vulnerability is found in these open source programs that are embedded within the core product, sometimes known as supporting programs, will they defend them for you? Will they provide you patches or mitigating actions? Or will they point you to the associated environment or the associated group? Now, from the information we hold, both of your environment and of threat intelligence, we can start to inform on the likelihood of compromise. And we do this by understanding how an attacker might move through your environment and position themselves in a way where they'll either exploit your environment, take data out, or prevent you from operating. Now, there are a few models we can employ, and we're not going to go into these in sufficient detail, but we'll just touch them at a high level. The first at the top there is known as the kill chain model, developed by Lockheed Martin. It's a high-level way of describing how a threat actor might move through. It's quite educational, but it's a good place to start. But what's more detailed is this MITRE attack model. Now, MITRE doesn't actually stand for anything, apparently. The guy that developed it, James McCormack, apparently just thought the name MITRE sounded cool and would be provocative. But what the MITRE attack path does is it starts to break down all the various steps of how an attacker would move through. Simply put, we can start to predict how this threat actor will operate. This enables us to detect them, but then with other calculations and observations, such as common vulnerability scoring system, which allows us to rank and rate them, environmental prediction scoring system, so we can start to tailor it a little bit more, weakness enumeration, so the technologies and tactics that they might use, and then other things such as environmental and temporal scoring. We can start to tailor and get a very precise prediction of the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited. More importantly, we can start with additional intelligence to put blockers at numerous levels to prevent this attack from ever happening, i.e., we're starting to reduce the likelihood of a known vulnerability being exploited. And that with impact is reducing your risk.
So how do we defend for both known and unknown security risks? Firstly, there is no such thing as a security silver bullet. And therefore, the application of compound mitigations are imperative. And this is following a defense in depth approach. Defense in depth is an effective cybersecurity solution in which there are multiple layered defenses within an organization that can reduce the likelihood of any known and unknown vulnerabilities from being exploited. And ultimately, if one mechanism fails, another control steps up and reduces the likelihood of that attack from being successful. People often refer to the defense in depth approach as being a castle theory or a castle approach. And this is due to the fact that a defense in depth approach is similar to what we've seen when protecting a medieval castle. And as you can see here on the slide, we have multiple layered defenses that can stop a medieval threat actor from gaining access to your castle and your critical assets within. So here you can see we have the moat, we have the drawbridge, we have the towers, and we have the battlements. From a cybersecurity perspective, those controls could be similar to having access management, access control solutions, proxy servers, firewalls, threat intelligence, and so on. Can anyone in the audience tell me what the image is on the right-hand side?
It looks like a steel cable, maybe cut into, or data cable.
Yeah, that's correct. So what we have here is a deep sea cable. And straight away you can see here that within the deep sea cable, we have a defense in depth approach that is protecting the critical asset, which is a fiber optic running through the center and the core of the cable. So one thing we need to bear in mind is you need to defend the critical assets within your organization, regardless of the solution, the product, the version number, its custom configuration, or whether that's bundled within open source components. One approach we take within Origna is through our vulnerability advisory service, where we use threat intelligence to analyze all the potential vulnerabilities that could impact our customers within their IBM and divested HCL products. And one of the key things here to understand is when a vulnerability is disclosed, it is provided and given a CVE ID. And for the benefit of today, we have the CVE, which stands for the critical vulnerability and exposure, followed by the year, which in this case is 2022, and followed by unique reference number. And the key bits of information that you can take from here are this vulnerability itself has a potential high confidentiality, integrity, and availability impact. And customers can utilize this information to ensure that they have the correct defense in depth and mitigation strategies and layers in place to reduce the likelihood of this being exploited. One of the elements that we see that is often a challenge within organizations is ultimately trying to prioritize and understand where you should place your efforts. And from an Origna perspective, we've developed a risk graphic for our customers, which ultimately presents the top 20 risks based on their software products that they currently have under support. And in the top left corner, you can see the largest box, which denotes the highest potential impact to our customers. And then in the bottom right corner, we have the lowest severity CVE. And ultimately, what this means is the customer can look at this risk graphic and try and understand and prioritize their efforts in performing any mitigating activities. So taking this a stage further, here we have the cone of plausibility. Now, this is an analytical technique that threat analysts can use to try and determine any likely threat actor scenarios based on known drivers and geopolitical events. If your organization is unable to do this, could start to utilize the open source intelligence framework. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's actually done this in the past, but if you look at multiple, or if you were to use a number of these sources available to you, is actually quite frightening and amazing, the information you can actually find out about yourself. One point we see in Origna is, as you can see from the graph here, the number of reported vulnerabilities is growing year on year. One approach organizations could take is to ensure that their product or their solution, whether that be regardless of your context, is deployed in the most secure configuration possible. Instead of trying to play whack-a-mole with the reported vulnerabilities that, as I've mentioned, are growing year on year, if you can understand your context and ensure that all your applications, software, or solutions are deployed in the most secure configuration possible, you can reduce the likelihood of both known and unknown vulnerabilities from being exploited. The key thing to bear in mind here is the threat landscape is never static. So this process of having a secure configuration should be reviewed on a regular basis to ensure that that configuration is mitigating the risks posed by the vulnerabilities themselves that impact your environmental context.
So what are we saying? Well, firstly, don't wait for that patch fix. It may never come. It may not be appropriate for your environment. And also don't play whack-a-mole with these vulnerabilities. You'll never keep up. As we saw, it's exponentially growing year on year, the number of vulnerabilities detected. We're also seeing the number of increased false positives from scanners and things increasing almost in step. And there is so much beyond the patch for an effective vulnerability management program. First point we'll say is context is key. You can't defend what you don't know. And you can't achieve success unless you've defined what success is, what is acceptable. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a moving target, so it's something you have to iterate on a fairly regular basis to make sure that you are still aligned with both your internal business environment, your technology environment, and your external threat environment. Also, knowing your environment is key, not just from a technology perspective or threat environment perspective, but who's around to help you? What are the capabilities of your engineering teams? What are the capabilities of your security teams? What are the capabilities of your third-party support, such as third-party software maintenance providers? Are you fully leveraging the value of the services they offer to ensure that, one, you can be proactive, secondly, you can respond to identified intelligence, and should the worst happen, you have the support team you need around you to address that incident. We also recommend implementing a risk-based approach, and especially where the patch fix is not available to you. Be sure to iterate what is your acceptable level of risk, and also that your internal processes are geared towards addressing the risk in your environment. We quite regularly see customers where the teams are more concerned about making the process work and reporting up the chain than actually securing the environment. What are they marked on? So I would review that as well. Thirdly, I'd also say own the risk. Do you know who is accountable for that risk? Who is going to stand up and say, yes, it's been addressed? Or if it is compromised, who's going to put their hand up and support in its remediation? And don't let your security team simply throw that CV over that cubicle wall at your engineering teams. It has to be solved as a team. Make sure they're working together. One supporting in the identifying and analyzing that risk, the other one in mitigating it, and then together validating whether it has been achieved successfully. And by looking beyond the patch, not only do you unlock enhanced security, but you're starting to unlock the value, your return of investment on the technologies that you've bought. You can start to extract yourself from that forced upgrade cycle. Upgrade, new version does not mean necessarily more secure. So you can start to analyze that a little bit better. And you can start to focus as a security and an engineering team on delivering your critical business requirements, and therefore more successful in your own respective business market. And then repeat. As we've said, nothing is constant. You could argue that the only constant is nothing is constant. So get ahead of that curve, or as we said at the start, beyond the patch. thank you for your time. Thank you for your attendance. If anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
That was very, very informative. Thanks very much. I have a question in terms of penetration testing, threat-led penetration testing. With the likes of Dora and NIS2 coming down the road for lots of organizations, how do you envisage people using outsourced software? How are they going to be managing this level of risk as we go into a more regulated world?
Well, certainly this is one thing, as you say, in the introduction and the evolution of certainly European financial service regulations is one under the Cyber Resilience Act and DORA and everything. We see this actually as a positive because it's going to inform us on, or inform the customer rather than on threats intelligence. So TIBA testing for financial services is an example. I think this delivers two things. One, more realistic rather than hypothetical scenarios. So what we saw there was a lot of threat intelligence based hypothetical scenarios. And then with the appropriate pen testing, that can actually be tested and validated. And the little path we found through, they might find other ways, or they might actually disprove one of those paths. So that just enhances us and allows us to understand the behaviors of the way that a vulnerability may be exploited, and as such supports us in providing the defensive mechanisms or the changes or the configurations, but it also supports the customer in determining when is enough. And that is balanced against the business and your investment, etc.
Okay, we'll have a question here from the online audience. The first one here is from Sarah. Let me just read it out here. How do you deal with devices that organizations do not own? I guess this is around people installing third-party, bringing on their personal devices, installing apps or whatever, and then somehow connecting to your corporate network. And how do you make sure?
So yeah, bring your own devices, or even third-party devices, so there's a big third-party risk structure here of, say, third parties integrating with your technology environment. The nice thing about a risk model is, whilst there might be a responsible and accountable person of that technology, you can have an internal person, if you will, who's responsible and accountable for the associated risk. Now, certainly from my experience, if you make your controls to prevent a lot of this, so say banning bring your own devices, you can actually force bad behavior underground. And that's actually really hard to then monitor and defend against. So the risk owner really needs to find that perfect balance between business enablement, but then also the risk exposure. And to achieve that, they need to look at that broader environment. So what are they trying to achieve? What's the cost function? Bringing your own device or not? But I think the key thing for me is it's not such a digital decision, if you will, as to whether you do or you don't. It takes more of a team effort with the focus on business enablement, but then also is that an associated or acceptable risk associated with it?
And I guess one piece I'd like to add to that is, as we've kind of covered today about having that risk-based approach, if organizations can understand the risks posed by a bring your own device policy, then they can also ensure that they have the correct mitigations and defensive actions in place if that device potentially were to be compromised. And as Ben's mentioned, it's obviously that balance between delivering the business outcome and also ensuring that that is kept within a secure manner.
Okay, thanks so much. I have another question in here from Charles in Mayo. How in practical terms can resources be estimated for in-company team to assess cybersecurity risks?
Yeah,
It depends.
Yeah, it depends. That's a great security answer. I think the key thing here is you build up your database. You understand what you can and what you can't do, and your level of expertise and competencies. And this is what I was referring to, knowing your teams. So we work with some very competent engineering teams where we can simply go make configuration change X, and they're straight onto it. They know exactly where to go and where to navigate. We can talk to other companies where they don't have that in-house expertise, or it's been lost because it's an old technology and the developer and the architects moved on, or indeed it's been outsourced to a sort of a managed service and they don't have the expertise. So identifying that skill gap early is key. That you then can inform where you can locate and identify those skills. And then typically we find with those engineers, both with the experience of data, but also the experience of the engineer or technician themselves, the accuracy around predicting the resource utilization time response effort, etc., starts to become a little bit clearer.
And
Okay.
again, I'd just like to kind of add a little bit more to that. I mean, we covered a lot of it today. When you're looking at the threat intelligence landscape, we covered it. It's all about understanding your context. So from an Origina perspective, how we deal with the resources and the threat intelligence is around an intelligence collection plan. And that is ultimately knowing the context of your environment to make sure that you're getting the information you need and you're not getting all the information you don't need, which is obviously burning your resource time. You know, that obviously burns the teams, and people ultimately are just trying to focus on the task in hand.
Okay, thank you. I have another online question here from Daniel Cusson. What are your thoughts on the recent trouble with the compression library in SSH? And is this a future vector we have to be concerned about?
So, yeah,
Question.
I think when we start talking about SSH, secure data transition or transportation, cryptography and things like that, this is definitely a world where there is no, shall we say, silver bullet. So if we look at the progression of cryptography, you could argue that the encryption and the security of the data, whether it be at rest and transit, is massively increased. But there are some technologies or cryptographies or connections out there now which can actually inadvertently break some of your existing defensive measures, depending on how they encrypt the entire packet of the message. So, for example, quite often defensive measures validate the source of that data. Now, if that flag or that header has been encrypted, then how do you validate the source? So I think the biggest thing is, should we be concerned about this more than others? Well, that depends on your own context, and that's where this threat intelligence analysis needs to come in. But what I would always say is that not to sort of leap into the latest thing or the latest upgrade. I would look at the pros and cons first, and the investment and the changes required, because another challenge we come across is you change one bit and then you have loads of interoperability challenges, and actually, which is the greater risk? Having that more mature and insightful approach would be my recommendation.
Okay, and I have another question here from Mike. He doesn't say where he is. How can you harmonize the risk level different experts give when so much of it is opinion based?
Yeah, I think it's obviously an organizational challenge, but ultimately I think it's about teams sitting down and trying to understand the actual risks that they face, reviewing their extant and existing security controls, and then trying to collectively understand and verify where their level of acceptable risk lies. It certainly is a challenge. You know, it's something that we face on a day-to-day basis dealing with organizations. But ultimately, as Ben mentioned, it's about understanding who is the accountable party and who ultimately owns that risk. And that should support you in trying to harmonize that process.
Yeah, we certainly see it where everything's suddenly the biggest risk going, and not everything can be the bigger risk. So how do you start to prioritize, and how do you start to segregate it? I think where the real challenge comes in is where you get compound risk, where you might get lots of small risks where you think, oh, that's fine. But what's the likelihood of all these small risks chaining up to create an environment where you'll see a substantive failure or a substantive cyber attack? That could be, what's the likelihood of 3 different controls failing at the same time? Or it could be the likelihood of, well, you know, if that misconfiguration is wrong, we've got this and this, but what's the likelihood if it's 3 engineering teams all in the same sort of data path, all making a tiny error and just leaving a path through, maybe misconfiguration or validation of how high or lower risk is. So as Lee said, you know, it needs to be that, it needs to start at a higher environmental systems based level. And as we sort of discussed about the new regulations, they're pushing for this, for the resilience, the systems of systems. So you can have the strongest, most secure bank in the environment, but they're all connected, and their huge investment in their own cybersecurity defenses could be completely invalidated by a small starter as a back-end link to their databases.
Any more questions in the audience? Oh, Daniel Cusson sent one more, so we'll have one more question from the online. Let me try and paraphrase this a bit. How do you deal with people who know enough to make themselves dangerous, like engineers who think they know better than the security team? This one might be a bit pointed.
Well, I think this sort of is akin to, I think that, you know, it can work both ways. I mean, I guess you could say I'm poacher term gamekeeper. I was an engineer and now security, but there is no advantage to anyone of just throwing, if you will, from a security side, a CVE over the wall and saying, catch, deal with it, because it's a different language. Quite often the engineers are there looking at it. And I'll put, you know, my hand up and say, when I was an engineer, quite often it was, you know, sort of brush it to one side. I know better than this. But building that teaming ethos, breaking down those silos, having regular communication, and more importantly, expressing the why we're doing this. Because it's very easy to see security controls as just a blocker to you doing your daily business. But if there's the understanding of the why, the bigger picture, but also that consultation around, well, okay, we need to prevent this, but again, when is enough enough? Or is there an alternative way we can enable you to do your business without impeding it because of security constraints or requirements?
Okay, I think, yeah, that's all the questions that we have. I'd like to, once again, on behalf of Engineers Ireland's Electronic and Computing Division, thank you very much for your presentation, and we will say goodbye to our online audience.